Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. I'm always excited to share with you Friday Fundamentals. Friday Fundamentals. And the title should be is What is the Purpose of Principle? You see the question mark afterwards. I couldn't get all the characters on there. But what is the purpose of principle? That's what I want to talk to you about. When we read scripture, of course, there are truths to believe and there are promises to claim and there are commands to obey. Truths to believe, promises to claim, and commands to obey. You may have heard that in time past. But what do you do when you come to a gray area? What do you do when there's no direct command, perhaps, or an approved example? What do you do when there may not be a necessary inference? Now, in our fellowship, they call that pattern theology. And some have argued that that's a flawed theology. And I would suggest that any theology that you use is somewhat flawed, but a faith group has to determine their approach of how they arrive at what they believe. And so in churches of Christ, the command, the example, and the inference has been the approach that has been used and has been successful. But I want you to be thinking about how do you arrive at a general principle. I was in conversation with a preacher, and he asked, "What is principle? What is a principle?" Well, a general principle is a biblical norm or a biblical standard that may be applied to more than one type of situation. Now, that's a hermeneutical definition. A general principle is a biblical norm or standard that may be applied to more than one type of situation. Now, keep in mind that when we read scripture, when we read the Bible, we're reading what's inspired of God. And God is the author behind the author. Now, I point that out because I am not against authorial intent. That, of course, you got to find out what was in the mind of the writer when he wrote what he wrote. You've got to understand the historical and cultural and syntactic background. But never forget that God inspired men to write what we're reading today. And so I always try to move people to understand that God is the author behind the authors, which simply means that God wanted that specific group to know something. But because of the wisdom of God and because of his sovereignty and his all knowing and because of his character being powerful, he wanted us to know some things as well. So keep in mind that when we read scripture, there are truths to believe, there are promises to claim, and there are commands to obey. But how do you apply a general principle in gray areas? And again, a general principle is a biblical norm or standard that may be applied to more than one type of situation. So when we talk about a general principle, we're saying that principles in scripture have the same authority as explicit commands or explicit directives. Let me give you an example. In 1 Timothy 2, Paul instructs that prayer ought to be made for kings and for those in authority. Now, that's specific. Paul is talking to Timothy. Timothy is preaching in Ephesus. That's a specific directive to Timothy. But the principle, are y'all with me? The principle even applies today. So, as much as we might be in disagreement with those who lead us, who govern us, uh, the principle says that the Christian should pray for the president. I don't want to get in any trouble, but I'm just trying to make a point. To give you another example, in Matthew 5, Jesus, you said we ought not use the word raka because that's derogatory, you know. But the general principle to us today is that the Christian should not use any derogatory term. Are you with me? I just want to, this is fundamentals, you know. This is, I'm not trying to be deep or mysterious. You can read McQuilkin's book on understanding and applying the Bible, but I think these are just basic general principles. And again, I want to restate that general principles have the same authority as explicit directives. Someone may ask, where do principles come from? Well, in this short time that we have, um, a general principle can be explicitly stated. It can be an explicitly stated principle. In Leviticus 19 and verse 18, um, they are commanded to love thy neighbor as thyself. All right. But that's a principle that can be applied today. Um, I've had conversation with people about, is a passage descriptive or is a passage prescriptive? You know, everything that we read in the Bible was written to a certain group to describe a situation that was taking place at that time. But if you understand principle, then you understand that the principle applies to us today, even though the writer was writing to a particular audience and dealing with a particular situation. The principle applies even today. So we are to love our neighbors, even as ourselves. Jesus repeated that in the 5th chapter of in the Sermon on the Mount, and also when we talk about the Good Samaritan. And then, as a close, there are explicit declarations that we develop logical deductions from. All right. The Old Testament, Exodus chapter 20, scripture teaches that one should not commit adultery. In Matthew 5, Jesus said, you don't have to commit the physical act to commit adultery, but if you lust after someone, you have already committed adultery in your heart. What's the general principle? Or is there a general principle that can be learned from those two passages of scripture? I believe that the general principle teaches us sexual purity. Sexual purity. Well, there's more I want to say, but I try to be brief in these Friday fundamentals. Friday fundamentals. Let's remain committed that when we read the Bible, there are truths to believe, promises to claim, and commands to obey. And I know some have difficulty with that command part. And I want to say some more, but I'm going to save it for later. And even when it comes to worshiping God, I think there are truths to believe, there are promises to claim, and commands to obey. We got to be very careful uh, and understanding how God speaks to us through His Word. That's our Friday fundamental for today, and I appreciate you. And it is a beautiful day in the neighborhood. So until next time, may the Lord bless you, and may He bless you real